The day after my husband's funeral, I found a letter he'd hidden under the floorboards. It wasn't a love note, it was a warning. And as I read it, I realized his death wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of a truth someone didn't want me to find. I had never expected it to end like this. I always thought that when the time came for me to say goodbye to my husband Patrick, it would be in the comfort of our home. A soft hand to hold, perhaps a tear or two, but a sense of peace between us. I thought our love would carry me through, just as it had for the last 45 years of marriage. Instead, I found myself sitting in a cold, unfamiliar office, listening to my daughter-in-law, Rebecca, announce to a room full of strangers that I was being cut out of my husband's $52 million estate. It was at the will reading that it hit me. I sat there frozen, every part of me stiffening as I heard Rebecca's voice ring out, cold and unwavering. She spoke with such authority, like she had every right to be there, as if my years of sacrifice, my devotion, my care for Patrick when he could no longer walk, meant nothing at all. I had spent every moment of the last 6 months at his bedside, sleeping in a chair, helping him with his meals, watching as he withered away. And now, here I was, invisible. The lawyer had been reading the will out loud, but I wasn't really hearing him anymore. I couldn't. The words blurred into the background as my thoughts scrambled to make sense of it all. It was as if I had been erased from my own life. The man I had married, the one I had loved, the one who had always promised me that we would grow old together, had somehow allowed all of this to happen. I had been reduced to nothing more than a footnote in the final chapter of his life. And then, in the midst of it all, something strange happened. The lawyer, who had been droning on about accounts, stocks, and properties I couldn't bring myself to care about, suddenly let out a laugh. A short, awkward laugh that didn't feel right. The whole room seemed to shift, as if something had just broken through the surface, something hidden beneath the layers of legal jargon and emotionless paperwork. The lawyer cleared his throat, but it was too late. That laugh hung in the air like a cloud, making me feel that all was not as it seemed. That was when I felt it. Patrick's presence, in the strangest, most unexpected way. It was as if he was speaking to me from beyond the grave. I had never believed in ghosts or spirits, but in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to tell me something he hadn't been able to say before his death. But what was it? What had he hidden? And why, in that instant? Did I feel like I had finally begun to understand the truth? As the lawyer's voice continued to echo in the background, I couldn't help but remember how Patrick had always believed that life was messy, that it should be real. Funerals, he would say, should be loud. People should cry, laugh, forget their umbrellas, forget their keys. Life should be messy. Death, too. But that was not what I was witnessing. The funeral had been everything he had never wanted. Cold, perfect, and controlled. Rebecca had arranged it all. Every detail down to the flowers, the slideshow, and the coffee cups. It was so flawless, so rehearsed, it made me feel like an intruder, like I was not meant to be a part of it. It was as though I had been cast aside, left to watch from the sidelines while everyone else moved on with their carefully orchestrated lives. Patrick would have hated it. I stood there, watching the last of the guests leave, each one slipping into their cars without a word to me. It felt as if they had all disappeared into the night, leaving me behind, alone. Not a single person thought to offer me a ride home. Not even Rebecca. I remember staring at the half-filled cups left on the tables, the folding chairs stacked neatly to one side. The smell of cut lilies lingered in the air, but it was all so lifeless, so staged. No one had asked if I needed a ride. No one had asked how I was holding up. I had spent months tending to Patrick, caring for him when he could no longer care for himself, and now it was as if I had never existed at all. As the funeral ended and the last of the guests drove away, I stood in the garden, feeling as though I was standing on the edge of some vast, empty chasm. The world continued to turn around me, but I felt as though I had been left behind. I had been erased. My years of devotion, of love, of sacrifice counted for nothing in the eyes of those I had called family. But then the lawyer laughed, and for the first time since Patrick's death, something inside me began to stir. It was like a flicker, a faint spark, but it was enough to remind me that something more was at play here. Patrick had always said he didn't want to leave things neat and tidy. He wanted real life. He wanted things to be messy. And so, standing there in that empty garden, feeling the weight of all that had been taken from me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fade into the background, not without understanding what had happened. I was going to find out what Patrick had left behind, what he had hidden, and why it felt like he was still speaking to me, even in death. The real story, the one I had been kept out of, was about to unfold, and I was determined to find out the truth, no matter where it led. The drive back to the house felt endless. The world outside the window moved too fast. The streets blurry, the trees and houses passing by like shadows I couldn't touch. I could barely keep my eyes open, and yet I couldn't bring myself to close them. My mind was still swirling, a storm of thoughts too heavy to hold. Patrick's absence weighed on me more now than ever. It had always been hard to see him deteriorate over the months, but I thought that after everything, I would at least have the comfort of knowing I was still part of the life we had built. But now it felt like I was no longer part of anything. I was just here, existing, but unseen. When I arrived back at the house, it was eerily quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that settles deep into your bones, filling up every corner of the space until it feels like the house itself is holding its breath. The walls, which once felt so full of life, now seemed to echo with emptiness. Patrick's absence was everywhere, yet his presence was too, like a ghost that wouldn't leave, haunting every room, every corner. I stood there in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, unable to move. The house we had built together, the one that had been full of laughter, full of plans and dreams, now felt like a stranger's home. I stepped inside slowly, my feet making little sound against the wooden floor, and it occurred to me how unfamiliar it had become, how strange it all felt. The air smelled the same, faintly of his aftershave and the leather of his old chair by the fireplace. But it was nothing like before, nothing like the way it used to feel when he was here beside me, when everything felt real. I walked into the kitchen, the room where we had spent countless mornings together. The coffee pot was still out, just like he left it that morning when he'd struggled to rise from bed. It was the little things, the simple routines we had shared, that I found myself clinging to now. But there was no comfort in them, no warmth in the things that once made us feel so connected. I picked up the half-finished cup of coffee he'd left behind, but I couldn't drink it. The bitterness seemed to reflect how I felt inside, empty, hollow. The days after a funeral always feel like walking through fog. Everyone leaves, and you're left with the echoes of their voices, the weight of the silence that follows. I hadn't expected anyone to stay, but I suppose a part of me had hoped for at least some sign, some gesture to remind me that I was still someone to them. But no, they all filed out, every last one of them, as if my presence didn't matter, as if I had been left behind. And Rebecca, well, she was the worst of them all. I could feel the sting of her smile, The way she had held herself at the funeral, so controlled, so poised, as if she were the one who had been married to Patrick, as if she had been by his side all these years, not me. She had orchestrated every detail of the day, the flowers, the slideshow, the entire service. It was perfect, too perfect, almost mechanical in its precision. It was as though she had planned the funeral with an eye for perfection, not for honoring the man we had both loved. There had been no room for spontaneity, no room for grief to spill over, no room for the realness of life to show up. I remember how Patrick used to talk about funerals. He always said they should be messy. People should cry loudly, forget their umbrellas, and laugh too. He'd say, life should be messy, and death should be too. He hated the idea of perfect, staged endings. And yet, there I was, standing in the middle of a performance that felt colder than anything I had ever experienced. I could almost hear his voice, but it wasn't in the room. It wasn't in the house. It was just in my head. It was a whisper, telling me that he would have hated this, hated the cold perfection of it all. He would have wanted something real, something messy. But what could I do? As I sank into the chair by the window, I watched the last of the guests leave. Their cars pulled away one by one, and I felt the weight of it all settle in. Not one person thought to ask if I needed a ride. Not one person even acknowledged that I had been there for the last 6 months, that I had been the one to care for Patrick when he couldn't walk, when he couldn't remember the names of his own children. I was the one who had stayed awake beside him through the endless nights, and yet here I was, abandoned in the silence, like an afterthought. Rebecca had arranged it all, every last detail. She had made sure everything was perfect, but I couldn't help but wonder. Perfect for whom? Perfect for her? Perfect for the image she wanted to create? It felt as though everything about the day, everything about the funeral, had been designed to remove me from the equation, to make it as if I had never been a part of Patrick's life. And that thought, that realization, hit me harder than anything else. The house felt colder now, as if it, too, was mourning something it had lost. I had spent years here with Patrick, building a life, creating memories, and now I felt as though I was being erased from it. It was as if Rebecca had already begun to rewrite the story of our family. She had taken everything, even the memory of the love we shared, and turned it into something tidy, something easy for everyone else to digest. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I wasn't going to let anyone rewrite the story of our life together. Not Rebecca. Not anyone. I stood up from the chair, my hands shaking as I reached for my coat. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I needed to get out of this house. I needed to breathe. The silence in here was too loud, too deafening. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face like a slap, but it was a relief. For the first time in hours, I could breathe. I looked up at the sky, dark and heavy with the promise of rain, and I felt an odd sense of clarity. The fog was starting to lift. Patrick had always said he didn't want a neat, tidy life, and neither did I. I had lived for too long in the shadows of other people's expectations. It was time to step out of the quiet. Time to step into the mess of it all and find the truth that Patrick had left behind, the truth that had been hidden from me, and I was going to find it. The house greeted me with silence when I came back inside, though greeted doesn't quite feel right. It was more like the house had turned its back on me, the way an old friend might after years apart. I stood in the entryway for a long time, unable to move, my coat still on, my purse still dangling from my arm. The air felt heavy, stale somehow, even though the windows were cracked open. It was the same house Patrick and I had built from the ground up The same walls that had once echoed with laughter, arguments, music, and the quiet hum of two people growing old together. But now it felt hollow. It felt like a museum of someone else's life. I walked through the hallway, my footsteps soft against the floorboards. Each creak sounded different now, lonelier, sharper, as though the house itself was mourning. Patrick's cane still leaned against the wall near the coat rack. I had left it there after his last hospital stay, unable to move it. It had become a symbol of him, of everything that was gone, but not yet truly over. His shoes still sat by the door, neatly lined up just as he had left them. The sight of them made my throat tighten. In the living room, sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, landing on the armchair where Patrick used to sit every morning with his newspaper and coffee. I could still see him there, head tilted down, his reading glasses slipping a little on his nose. Sometimes he'd glance up and catch me watching him, and he'd smile, small, soft, the kind of smile that made the world feel safe. But now the chair was empty, and the sunlight felt cruel. It illuminated everything except what mattered. I sat down slowly, my knees aching, and let my hands rest on the armrest of his chair. The fabric was worn smooth from years of use, but the cushion was cold. I ran my fingers over the spot where his hand would rest, hoping to feel something, anything, a trace of warmth of him. But there was nothing, just air. It's strange how silence can make a house louder. I could hear the ticking of the old clock on the mantel, the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the whisper of wind outside brushing against the windows. Every sound felt magnified, like the world was reminding me of all the things that continued without him. I rose and walked into the kitchen, the one room that had always felt alive. Patrick used to joke that I lived in there, that I treated the stove like an altar. I suppose I did. It was where I found comfort, where I made sense of things. But now, even the kitchen felt foreign. The teapot was still on the stove, the one he bought me for our 30th anniversary. He said it whistled like an old man clearing his throat, and he wasn't wrong. I smiled faintly at the memory, but it didn't last. The smile slipped away just as quickly as it came. I poured myself a cup of tea, though I didn't really want it. The motion of it, the kettle, the cup, the spoon, was the only thing that made sense. I sat at the table where Patrick and I had shared countless meals, and for the first time in decades, the other chair was empty. It's one thing to lose a person. It's another to lose the rhythm of them, the way they filled a space, the way their presence anchored you. Without Patrick, the air felt thinner, the walls taller. Even breathing felt like an effort. I caught sight of the family photo on the counter. Me, Patrick, our 2 children, and Rebecca standing beside my son, with that perfect, polished smile. I looked at her face for a long time. Even in the picture, there was something distant about her, something carefully curated. Patrick used to say she was ambitious, but I saw something else: control. She liked things tidy, organized, predictable, and she had managed to turn my husband's funeral into exactly that, tidy and controlled. It was the opposite of who he was. The house was still filled with his scent, faint traces of cologne, the musk of old books, and the lingering warmth of his favorite wool sweater. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It hurt. It made me realize how quickly a life can vanish, how easily love can be packed into boxes and stored away. I looked around and felt it again, the sense that I didn't belong here anymore. This was our home, but now it felt borrowed, like I was occupying someone else's space. I whispered his name, half hoping that the house might answer, that maybe his voice might echo back. Just once. But there was only the steady tick of the clock and the distant hum of a car passing outside. That night, I couldn't bring myself to turn on the lights. I sat in the dark with my cup of tea gone cold, staring at nothing, listening to the silence stretch and stretch until it almost broke me. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I was grieving Patrick or grieving the life that was being taken from me piece by piece. Something inside me shifted that night. Not in anger, not yet, but in awareness. I realized that if I didn't fight for my place in this house, in this story, I would fade from it completely. I had been written out quietly, politely, with legal words and perfect smiles. But I wasn't gone. Not yet. And though I didn't know how, I promised myself that before this was over, I would find out the truth about what Rebecca had done, and why I could still feel Patrick's presence in every shadow of this silent house. The next morning, the house was still quiet, though a softer kind of quiet. Not the hollow silence of grief, but the kind that follows when something in you has gone still. I moved slowly through the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea I didn't intend to drink. The tea had become my ritual since Patrick's passing, not for comfort, but for rhythm. I needed something to hold, something warm, something that made me feel like I was still part of the living. The sunlight drifted weakly through the window, catching on the dust motes that danced lazily in the air. I watched them for a long time, almost hypnotized. The world outside seemed to be moving on just fine, the mail truck rumbling down the street, the neighbor's dog barking in the yard, but inside, time had stopped. That's when the knock came. It wasn't loud, just a polite tapping, hesitant, almost guilty. I opened the door to find Rebecca standing there, her posture as stiff as ever. She didn't meet my eyes right away. She was dressed in her usual precision, tailored coat, hair perfectly pulled back, not a strand out of place. Grief, for her, was something to be managed, organized, and scheduled between business meetings. "Morning, Eleanor," she said flatly. Her voice carried no warmth, no trace of the girl I'd once known, the young woman who used to come to this very house every Sunday for lunch, laughing as she helped Patrick in the garden. I wanted to drop something off before I head into the office. Before I could respond, she held out a small box, brown cardboard, no wrapping, no note, just a label in Patrick's handwriting, neat but slightly uneven, the way it had become in his final months. Seeing his writing again made my chest tighten. "He asked me to give you this," Rebecca said, her tone careful, controlled. "Said it was meant for you." Her words sounded rehearsed, as though she'd practiced them. I took the box from her hands. It was surprisingly light. "Did he say what it was?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "No. Just that you should have it." There was a pause, a long, awkward stretch of silence that filled the doorway between us. I thought maybe she would say something kind, maybe offer a word of comfort. But she didn't. She just smiled, that polite, practiced smile of hers, and turned to leave. "Rebecca," I said softly. She stopped, but didn't turn around. "I appreciate you bringing it," I managed to say. She nodded once, still not looking back. "Of course," she replied. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor." And then she was gone. I closed the door slowly, the sound of her car pulling away fading into the distance. For a while, I just stood there, the box resting in my hands. I don't know why, but I was afraid to open it. Patrick had never been one for mystery. He was direct, simple in his gestures. If he wanted to leave me something, he would have told me. So why the secrecy now? Why this little box delivered by her, of all people? Eventually, I took it to the kitchen table and sat down. The tape peeled away easily. Inside, was a small velvet case, dark blue, almost black, and beneath it, a folded piece of tissue paper. My heart thudded as I opened the case. Inside was a silver tie clip. Simple, unremarkable, something he wore on special occasions, though never his favorite. I don't know what I had expected. A letter maybe, a note, something that said, "I'm sorry," or "I love you," or "Don't let them take what's yours." But there was nothing, just the tie clip gleaming dully in the morning light. I turned it over in my hand, looking for an engraving, a message, anything, but there was none. Just smooth, cold metal. It was the kind of gift that felt more like a question than an answer. I sat there for a long time, the box open in front of me, trying to make sense of it. Why would Patrick leave this for me? And why through her? Then a thought crept in, one I didn't want to entertain. What if he hadn't left it for me at all? What if this was something else? Something she wanted me to believe came from him. The idea sent a shiver through me. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell myself I was being paranoid, but the truth was, nothing about Rebecca's calm face at the will reading, or that faint, knowing smile when she'd spoken, felt right. I picked up the tie clip again, feeling its weight. Light, almost insignificant. But it wasn't the object itself that mattered. It was what it represented. It was the only thing of his that she had chosen to hand me. No letter, no words, just a cold, silver symbol of something unfinished. That night, I placed it on Patrick's desk, beside the framed photo of us on our wedding day. I stared at it for a long time, the way one might stare at a puzzle missing its final piece. There was a story behind it. I could feel it. But for now, all I had was silence and a small, gleaming reminder that something wasn't right. As I turned off the light, I whispered to the empty room, "What are you trying to tell me, Patrick?" The tie clip caught the faint glow of the streetlight through the curtains, reflecting just enough to look like it was answering. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay awake in the quiet house, the silver tie clip still resting on the desk across the room, catching the faint light from the street lamp outside. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Patrick's face, the way he used to smile when he'd catch me humming while I cooked, the softness in his eyes when he'd say my name. But now that same face seemed distant, hidden behind layers of things unsaid. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and wrapped my shawl around my shoulders. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my feet as I walked down the hall to Patrick's study. I turned on the small lamp on his desk. The golden light spilled over his scattered papers, his books, the framed photos of our children from years ago. Everything looked exactly as he had left it, but it didn't feel the same. My eyes landed on the tie clip again. It gleamed quietly, almost mocking me now. I picked it up and turned it over in my palm, hoping, wishing, it would make sense somehow. But it didn't. It was such a small thing, and yet it carried the weight of something unfinished, something important. Why this? Why now? Patrick had always been a sentimental man. He believed in words, letters, notes, messages tucked into lunchboxes, and scribbles on napkins. During our early years, he'd leave me little notes in the kitchen drawer or under my pillow. "For my Ellie, the heart of my world." That's what one of them had said, written in his neat cursive. But now, in the end, all I had was this cold piece of metal. No words, no warmth, just silence. And yet, something about it bothered me more deeply than I could explain. I set it back down and sank into his chair. The leather creaked softly under my weight. The air smelled faintly of his cologne, cedar and spice, and it nearly broke me. I closed my eyes and tried to remember our last conversation before his mind started to fade. He'd been sitting right here, looking tired but peaceful. I'd been begging him to rest, but he had smiled and said, "You don't have to worry about anything, Ellie." I've made sure of that. Those words, "I've made sure of that." They kept echoing in my mind now. If he had truly made sure, then why was I being left out of everything? Why was my name missing from the will? Why did Rebecca, someone who hadn't been there during his final months, suddenly hold all the power? I wanted to believe there was an explanation, maybe a misunderstanding. Maybe Patrick had been confused. But deep down, something inside me whispered that it wasn't confusion. It was something else, something deliberate. I got up and began to walk around the study, letting my fingers trail along the bookshelves. Patrick had always been meticulous. He kept everything organized. Bank papers, estate records, old letters, all filed neatly in labeled drawers. But now I noticed gaps, spaces where folders should have been. A few drawers weren't fully shut, as if someone had been through them recently. I pulled one open. Inside were financial records, mostly old ones, yellowed with age, but in the middle of them was a newer folder labeled Estate Updates, 2024. My chest tightened. I didn't remember seeing this before. I opened it slowly, my hands trembling. Inside were printouts, legal drafts, some partially signed, some not. One page caught my attention. It was a letterhead from Rebecca's law firm. My eyes scanned the text, and a chill ran through me. It was an amendment proposal for Patrick's trust, dated just 2 months before he died. 2 months. That was when he could barely hold a pen, and yet there it was, his signature at the bottom. Only, it didn't look quite right. The letters were uneven, slanted differently than his usual handwriting. I'd been with him for decades. I knew how he wrote. That signature wasn't steady. It was trembling, forced, maybe even guided. I pressed my lips together, my breath shallow. The deeper I looked, the more my heart pounded. The amendment transferred control of several key assets, including the family trust, to Rebecca's name for administrative efficiency. That phrase, so formal, so polished, felt wrong. Patrick would never have used it. I sat back in the chair, staring at the papers. My pulse was loud in my ears. Had he signed these willingly? Did he even understand what he was signing? Or had someone made sure he didn't need to understand? I wanted to dismiss the thought. It felt cruel to even think that Rebecca, my own daughter-in-law, could take advantage of him while he was so ill. But then I remembered the way she'd stood at the will reading, calm, collected, rehearsed. The way she hadn't met my eyes once. And something inside me shifted. It wasn't just grief anymore, it was suspicion. The tie clip wasn't just a gift. It was a message, a clue, maybe even a warning. Patrick had left it for me for a reason. He must have known something wasn't right, and this was the only way he could reach me now. As the clock ticked softly in the background, I realized that the silence in this house wasn't just the quiet of loss. It was the quiet before truth began to speak, and I was finally ready to listen. By Monday morning, the air in the house felt heavier than usual. The kind of heaviness that sits on your chest before a storm rolls in. I hadn't slept much the night before. The documents I'd found in Patrick's study were still spread across his desk, each one whispering a question I wasn't ready to answer. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his signature, shaky, uncertain, and Rebecca's name printed neatly at the bottom of every page. That morning, as I was pouring myself another cup of tea I wouldn't finish, an email arrived. The sender's name was familiar, Rebecca's law firm. The subject line read, Estate Administration Meeting, Mandatory Attendance. I stared at the screen, my hand frozen around the mug. The meeting was set for Wednesday at 9 in the morning. No greeting, no explanation, no, I hope you're well. Just a time and place, like a business appointment. And I suppose that's what it had become now. My husband's life, our memories, our years together. All reduced to an agenda item in some downtown office. I told myself I didn't have to go, that I could stay home, let them do what they wanted. But something deep inside, that small, persistent flicker of defiance, wouldn't let me. I needed to see her face. I needed to understand what she was doing, and why. When Wednesday came, the city was still waking up. I took the early bus, the one Patrick and I used to ride when we went to the farmer's market on weekends. I sat near the window, watching the world go by in shades of gray. I had dressed carefully that morning, my navy coat, the one Patrick had bought me for our anniversary. I wanted to look composed, not like the woman they had tried to erase. The law firm's building was tall, made of glass that reflected the pale morning sky. I hesitated before stepping inside, feeling like I was walking into enemy territory. The elevator ride to the 12th floor was silent except for the hum of machinery. When the doors opened, I was greeted by a sleek reception area, white walls, polished floors, and the faint scent of eucalyptus and printer ink. Everything about it screamed precision and control. "Mrs. Harper?" the young receptionist asked, her tone polite but detached. I nodded. "They're waiting for you in conference room B. They. Not she, not Rebecca, just they." The door to the conference room closed behind me with a soft click, and I immediately felt small. 7 people sat around a long table, men in dark suits, women in muted tones. At the head of the table sat Rebecca. She didn't stand when I entered, didn't smile, didn't even pretend to. She just nodded slightly, a gesture that felt more like acknowledgement than greeting. "You can take a seat," she said, her voice crisp, professional, almost mechanical. I sat at the far end of the table, away from the folders neatly arranged in front of her. The air smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Rebecca began speaking as if she were reading from a script. "As executor of the estate," she said, "I'll be walking everyone through the final distribution of assets as per the revised will." Revised. That word made my stomach turn. She listed properties, investments, bank accounts, shares, all in the same calm, steady tone. Her hands never trembled, her gaze never faltered. I noticed how she never once used Patrick's name. She said the deceased instead. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap. Every few minutes, someone would nod or scribble a note. No one looked at me. I wasn't part of the conversation. I wasn't even part of the room. Then she said it, so casually, like it meant nothing. As of March of this year, control of the family trust was transferred to me for management purposes. I felt a sharp pulse behind my ribs. "That's not possible," I said softly. But no one responded. My voice barely reached the middle of the table. Rebecca continued, flipping through her folder. "All transactions and distributions will follow the structure outlined here," she said, tapping the page. "There are no additional provisions assigned to Mrs. Harper under the current filing." The words hit me harder than I expected. No provisions, no home, no inheritance, no recognition, just absence. For a moment, the room went still. One of the younger men shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Rebecca didn't flinch. She didn't even glance my way. When the meeting ended, I didn't move. Everyone else filed out, murmuring polite goodbyes, avoiding my eyes. Rebecca stayed behind, closing her briefcase with deliberate calm. I thought she might say something, maybe an explanation, maybe a justification, but she didn't. As I stood to leave, she finally looked at me, cold, distant, unreadable. "This isn't personal, Eleanor," she said. "It's just procedure." Just procedure. That phrase echoed in my head long after I left the building. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. I felt hollow, like someone had reached into my life and scraped everything out, leaving only the shell of what once was. As I walked toward the bus stop, I realized that Rebecca hadn't just taken control of the estate. She had taken control of the story, of Patrick's legacy, of our life together, of everything that carried my name. And in that moment, I made myself a quiet promise. She may have rewritten the documents, but she wouldn't rewrite me. The next few days passed in a blur. I went through the motions, eating, sleeping, watering the plants, but it all felt mechanical, hollow. My mind kept circling back to that meeting, to Rebecca's voice as she said, "There are no remaining distributions assigned to Mrs. Harper under the current filing." Each time the memory surfaced, it hit me harder. The way she'd said it, calm, almost indifferent, as if she were reading a weather report, not erasing my entire life from the page. By Friday, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know how all of this could happen, how my husband's trust, our home, and everything we had built together could suddenly belong to someone else. So I did what I had promised myself I wouldn't. I called Rebecca. She answered on the second ring, her voice smooth and composed. "Eleanor," she said, like my name was a formality. "I wondered when you'd call." Her tone made it clear she had been expecting this. "I need to talk to you," I said, "in person." There was a short pause. "Of course," she replied. "Why don't you come by the house tomorrow morning? I'll make time before my meetings." Her house. That's what she meant. My house. The one Patrick and I had built together. The one she now seemed to think belonged to her. The next morning was gray and drizzling when I arrived. The front gate squeaked as I pushed it open. I hadn't been back since the funeral, and seeing it again, the roses Patrick had planted years ago, the worn porch steps, the wind chime he had made from old keys, it all felt wrong, like walking into a memory that no longer belonged to me. Rebecca was already inside, dressed as if she were heading to a board meeting rather than a conversation with the woman she had just disinherited. She didn't greet me. Instead, she gestured toward the dining table where several thick folders were neatly stacked. "I thought it might help to go over the documents," she said. "It's all pretty straightforward." Straightforward. The words scraped against me like sandpaper. I sat down slowly, my eyes scanning the pages spread before me. Legal documents, amendments, signatures. Patrick's name, shaky and uneven, appeared again and again. My stomach turned. "When were these changes made?" I asked quietly. "About 6 months ago," Rebecca replied, flipping through the pages as if she were discussing a quarterly report. "Patrick felt it was time to make things more organized. I helped him meet with the firm to ensure everything was properly updated." I looked up at her. "Organized?" He never mentioned any of this to me. She didn't flinch. "He didn't want to worry you." Something in her tone made me stop. There was a detachment to it. The kind of tone you use when you've already rehearsed the story you want others to believe. "And you're saying he made these decisions on his own?" Rebecca smiled faintly, not with warmth, but with precision. "Yes, everything was his choice. I just handled the logistics. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that Patrick had been of sound mind when he signed those papers, that he hadn't been pressured or confused. But deep down, I knew better. By then, he had been too weak to even climb the stairs without help. He was taking medication that made him drowsy, forgetful. There were days when he barely recognized the nurses, let alone understood legal documents filled with language even I struggled to follow. I reached for one of the pages and studied his signature. It wavered, unsteady, like a man trying to hold on to something slipping away. "He was very ill then," I said, my voice trembling. "He could barely sign his name." Rebecca's eyes flicked toward me, then away. "He was capable enough," she said simply. Something inside me snapped at that. Not anger, not yet, but something heavier. Grief mixed with disbelief. I closed the folder gently and sat back in my chair. "You were there, weren't you?" "When he signed these." "I was," she said. "He asked me to be." Her calmness was unbearable. "And you didn't think to tell me?" She hesitated for just a moment, the smallest flicker, before she regained her composure. "It wasn't my place, Eleanor. Patrick was very clear about wanting this handled privately." Privately. Another word she wielded like a knife. I stared at her, and for the first time I saw it. The subtle satisfaction in her expression, the way she controlled every detail, every word. It wasn't about money. It was about control, about power, about rewriting the story to make herself the center of it. I gathered my things slowly, my fingers trembling as I closed the folder. "You've done a very thorough job," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Patrick would have admired your efficiency." She tilted her head, studying me. "I know this is difficult for you, but he trusted me to take care of things." I met her gaze and managed a small, cold smile. "Oh, I'm sure he did." When I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and wilted roses. For a moment, I just stood there on the porch, my hand on the railing Patrick had built decades ago. Rebecca's words echoed in my head. He trusted me. Maybe he had, but I knew my husband, and if there was one thing Patrick never did blindly, it was trust. I walked down the steps, the damp wind brushing against my face, and made myself a promise. The same one that had started to take root inside me since the day of the will reading. Whatever Rebecca thought she had buried, I would find it. And when I did, I wouldn't stay silent. I didn't sleep that night either. My mind replayed every word Rebecca had said, every clipped sentence, every carefully chosen phrase. He trusted me to take care of things. The more I thought about it, the less it sounded like reassurance, and the more it sounded like a warning. I kept hearing Patrick's voice in my head, calm, steady, always the peacemaker, saying, "You don't have to worry, Ellie. I've made sure of everything." But what if that wasn't true? What if he had tried to make sure, and someone had made sure he couldn't? By morning I was sitting at his desk again, staring at the tie clip. It caught the sunlight that slipped through the blinds, gleaming faintly like a signal I couldn't yet understand. I reached for the folder I had found days before. The one labeled Estate Updates. 2024. There were details I hadn't fully gone through, notes scribbled in the margins, legal terms I didn't recognize. Patrick's handwriting appeared in fragments across the pages, weaker than I remembered, but still his. That's when I saw it, a line written in pencil at the top of one page. "Ask Daniel for review before final filing." Daniel. I hadn't thought about him in years. He'd been Patrick's oldest friend, a lawyer himself once, though retired now. They had known each other since college. Patrick trusted him more than anyone. If he had wanted a second opinion, it would have been Daniel. I didn't waste another moment. I found Daniel's old number in Patrick's leather address book, tucked behind a grocery list and a decades-old receipt from a bookstore. My hands trembled as I dialed. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered, roughened with age but steady as ever. "Daniel? It's Eleanor Harper." There was a pause, and then a soft, surprised exhale. Eleanor, it's been a long time. I know, I said, my voice barely holding together. I'm sorry to call like this. It's about Patrick. His tone changed instantly, quieter, careful. I heard about his passing. I was sorry to hear it. Thank you, I said, though the words caught in my throat. Daniel, I found something. Notes in his handwriting. Mentions of the will, revisions, your name. I think he wanted to speak with you before. I trailed off. Before everything fell apart, there was a silence on the line long enough for me to hear the ticking of Patrick's old clock in the background. Then Daniel spoke. I remember he called me last year, he said slowly. Wanted to discuss something about his trust. Said he was making changes but didn't want to finalize anything until we spoke in person. But then he canceled. Said Rebecca was helping handle it now. My stomach tightened. He canceled? Yes, Daniel said. Sounded tired. Said she'd taken care of everything. I didn't push. I thought maybe he just wanted things simple at the end. Simple. That word again. Everything about Rebecca's version of events had been simple. But life with Patrick was never simple. He loved the details, the discussions, the shared decisions. We never did anything alone, especially not something this important. Daniel, I said, could you meet me? There's something I think you need to see. Of course, he replied without hesitation. Tomorrow morning. My office. You remember where it is? I did. A small building off Elm Street, above a bakery that always smelled like fresh bread and cinnamon. Patrick used to tease Daniel about retiring and opening a pie shop instead. The thought made my throat ache. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long while. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than grief. A small, flickering sense of purpose. A thread to pull on. I opened Patrick's drawer again, looking for anything else that might help. Underneath a stack of old receipts, I found another note. Faded, written in blue ink this time. It wasn't a message, not really. Just a reminder scrawled hastily in his hand. Copies in safe. For Eleanor. I froze. The safe. Patrick had installed it behind the bookshelf years ago, hidden behind a row of old atlases. It hadn't been opened since before his illness. My fingers shook as I pulled the books aside, revealing the small metal door. I entered the code, our wedding date, and the lock clicked open. Inside, among old passports and insurance forms, was another manila folder. On the front, in Patrick's handwriting, were 3 words. Pending review, D.H. Daniel Harper. Inside the folder were early drafts of the will. Different versions, heavily annotated, with corrections and notes written in Patrick's familiar scrawl. One of them stopped me cold. There, on the second page, was a paragraph that had been crossed out in red ink, but still visible underneath. In the event of my passing, I leave full rights and ownership of our primary residence and associated trusts to my wife, Eleanor Harper. It had been crossed out, replaced by a typed line giving administrative oversight to Rebecca. In the margin, next to the red pen, Patrick had written a note so faint I could barely read it. Discuss this with Rebecca. Feels wrong. My heart pounded. I pressed my palm over my mouth, trying to steady my breathing. He had known. He had felt it. I placed the papers back gently, afraid they might crumble from the weight of truth. For weeks, I had been drifting, lost between grief and confusion. But now, for the first time, the fog began to lift. Patrick had tried to protect me. He had tried to leave a trail. Tomorrow, I would take everything to Daniel. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt something I hadn't in a long, long time. Hope. I arrived at Daniel's office the next morning just as the clock struck 9. The little bakery downstairs was open, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee drifted through the narrow hallway. For a brief moment, it almost felt like any other day, the kind Patrick and I used to share before everything began to unravel. But as I climbed the stairs and reached Daniel's door, reality settled back in like a weight across my shoulders. He greeted me with the same quiet warmth I remembered, his eyes kind but cautious. "Eleanor," he said softly, taking my coat. "You look tired." "I am," I admitted, "but I think I've found something." We sat across from each other at his old oak desk. The room was lined with books and stacks of files, but it felt nothing like Rebecca's office. There was no coldness here, no sterile order. Just the comfortable clutter of a man who had lived too many lives through other people's legal battles. I handed him the manila folder I'd found in the safe. "Patrick left this," I said. "There are drafts, notes, his handwriting. I think he was having doubts about the final changes." Daniel adjusted his glasses and began reading. I watched his face as his eyes moved over each page. The silence stretched, heavy with the sound of turning paper. When he reached the note in the margin, the one where Patrick had written "feels wrong," his brow furrowed. He set the paper down and looked at me. "You were right to come," he said. "These documents, they're not just drafts. They show intent. Patrick hadn't finalized the new terms. Legally, that could matter." I felt something in my chest loosen. Not relief exactly, but a flicker of validation. For weeks, I had been treated like I was imagining things, like grief had made me paranoid. Hearing Daniel say it, calmly, professionally, gave me strength. He continued, "See here? The handwriting, the language, this part mentions you directly. If the revised version crossed that out without proper witnessing or review, it raises serious questions." "Questions about Rebecca," I said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yes, and about how she was able to file these documents so quickly. You said she was present when he signed them." "She told me she was." "Then we'll need to confirm that, and whether anyone else witnessed it." He jotted down notes as he spoke. Names, dates, terms I didn't fully understand. Then he looked up again. "Eleanor, do you have any idea where the final signed version is kept?" I hesitated. Rebecca said it was with her firm. His lips pressed into a thin line. "That makes sense. But if what's in this folder is accurate, there may be more copies. At the county office, perhaps. I'll request certified versions of both the original and the revised filings. We'll compare them." It sounded so simple when he said it, but I could hear the caution in his voice. He was being careful. After a moment, he leaned back in his chair. "Patrick trusted me," he said softly. "I knew him for nearly 40 years. He wasn't a careless man. If he made changes, he would have discussed them with you. If he didn't, then something's off." I looked down at my hands. He was so tired at the end. I think he thought he was doing what was best for everyone. He trusted her, Daniel. Too much. He gave a slow nod. "That's often how these things begin." We spent the next hour going through every page, every note, until my head spun with legal terms and timelines. Before I left, Daniel made me promise to keep everything hidden and untouched. "Don't confront her," he warned. "Not yet. Let's confirm the facts first." As I stepped outside, the morning air felt cold but crisp. The drizzle had stopped, and sunlight was breaking weakly through the clouds. I stood for a moment, breathing it in. The city moved around me. Cars, people, life. But for the first time since Patrick's funeral, I didn't feel invisible. Back at home, I placed the folder back in the safe, locking it tight. Then I sat by the window, watching the wind tug at the garden leaves. I thought about Patrick, about the way his hand had trembled when he signed documents near the end, about the way he'd always insisted that I never let anyone handle things alone. It was as if he'd been warning me long before I realized it. And though my heart ached, I felt something else stirring now. A quiet resolve. I wasn't just his widow anymore. I was his witness. And whatever Rebecca had done, she had underestimated one thing. I wasn't finished. Not yet. The days following my meeting with Daniel passed slowly, each one sinking into the next like wet pages in a book. I tried to keep busy, tidying the garden, sorting through old linens, making soup I never finished, but the truth was, my thoughts never left those papers in the safe. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Patrick's handwriting, the uneven lines where he'd scrawled, "Feels wrong." I couldn't escape the feeling that he'd been trying to reach me, even from the other side of the silence Rebecca had built around him. On Wednesday afternoon, I went to dust the mantel and noticed one of Patrick's photos missing. It was the one of us taken in Maine, on the coast, our hair wind-blown, faces sunburned from a day spent walking the cliffs. I checked the other frames. Several were gone, books too. Whole sections of his collection had vanished from the shelf. Rebecca must have taken them. I remembered her mentioning archiving Patrick's personal items for the foundation after the funeral, but I hadn't imagined she'd be so literal about it. It felt like a theft, but not of things, of memory. She was taking pieces of him, quietly, efficiently, until there would be nothing left that spoke of who he really was. That night, I made myself tea and sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The city lights reflected in the puddles outside, shimmering and unsteady like everything else in my life now. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it all, that maybe Rebecca was just grieving in her own way. Maybe she truly thought she was preserving his legacy. But then I remembered the way she had spoken at that meeting, her voice measured and cold. There had been no grief in her tone, only possession. I glanced toward the study door. The safe was hidden behind it, behind a shelf of old atlases Patrick used to love. Inside it lay the truth, fragile, handwritten, but still alive. I felt the weight of it even from here, and I knew, with growing certainty, that I wasn't just dealing with an unfortunate misunderstanding. Something had been taken from me, deliberately. The next morning, Daniel called. "I've requested certified copies from the county," he said. "It'll take a few days, but I'll compare them with what you found." "Do you think Rebecca knew what she was doing?" I asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Eleanor," he said gently, "I think she knew exactly what she was doing." After the call, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the steam rising from my coffee. I thought about the last 6 months of Patrick's life, the hospital stays, the medications, the fog that would sometimes cloud his mind. Rebecca had always been there, hovering just close enough to seem helpful, but never warm enough to feel like family. She would arrive with paperwork, sit by his bed for hours, and leave without so much as a glance in my direction. At the time, I'd told myself she was just trying to help, but now, those memories felt different. They felt orchestrated. I remembered one evening, not long before Patrick's final decline. I had walked into the hospital room to find her sitting beside him, a stack of documents on her lap. Patrick had been signing something, his hand trembling. I'd asked what it was, and he'd looked up confused, as if he couldn't quite remember. Rebecca had smiled then, thin and polite, and said, "Just routine paperwork, Eleanor." Insurance matters, I'd believed her. I hadn't thought to question it. But now I knew better. That was no insurance form. That was the moment she'd begun rewriting our lives. Anger rose in me then, quiet but fierce, not the kind that shouts or breaks things, but the kind that grows roots. Deep, steady, and immovable. I wasn't going to let her erase me. Patrick had trusted her, yes, but he had also trusted me. And I owed it to him, to the life we built together, to make sure the truth didn't die in silence. That night, I took the tie clip from Patrick's desk and held it under the lamp. I turned it in my hand, studying its reflection. For weeks, it had felt meaningless, an afterthought. But as I looked at it now, I realized it wasn't random. Patrick had chosen it carefully. Something small, ordinary, easily overlooked, just like the truth he'd hidden in those drafts. He'd always told me, "The answers are never loud, Ellie. They whisper." Maybe this was his whisper. I set the tie clip beside the folder, side by side on the desk. For the first time, they felt like parts of the same story, one that wasn't finished yet. The pieces were starting to fit together, faintly but unmistakably. I wasn't sure what Rebecca had done exactly, but I knew this much. Patrick had sensed it. He'd tried to stop it, or at least to warn me. And now it was up to me to finish what he started. As I turned off the light and closed the study door behind me, I whispered into the dark, "I hear you, Patrick." And for the first time in weeks, the silence in the house didn't feel empty. It felt like an answer. The next few days settled into a strange rhythm, quiet on the outside, restless underneath. I went about my days as if nothing had changed, watering Patrick's plants, folding the laundry, cooking dinner for one. But inside, I was counting hours, waiting for Daniel to call with the results of his document request, waiting for proof that the unease I'd been living with wasn't just the invention of a grieving mind. On the third morning, the phone finally rang. I recognized his voice right away. Calm, deliberate, but tinged with something heavier than before. "Eleanor," he said, "I've reviewed the county filings. Something's not right." Those words confirmed everything my heart already knew. "What do you mean?" I asked. "The version Rebecca filed is different. Different from every draft Patrick ever shared with me. The case number on the filing doesn't match the one listed for the previous amendment, which is unusual. More than that, there's no record of the prior version being formally replaced. It's as if it vanished, wiped clean." For a moment, I couldn't speak. It felt like the air had been pulled from the room. Daniel continued. "I also checked the witness statements. 2 signatures. Neither name matches anyone Patrick or I have ever worked with. They're not on file as notaries in the local registry. One of them doesn't exist at all." I sank into the chair by the window, staring out at the garden. The wind was moving through the trees, but I barely saw it. "So she forged it?" He hesitated. "I can't say that yet. But someone manipulated the process. This wasn't a simple mistake." I let those words settle in, heavy and cold. Someone manipulated the process. I could almost see her, sitting in that sleek conference room, her hands folded neatly on the table, speaking about efficiency and procedure. How many times had she rehearsed this? How long had she planned it? "What do I do now?" I asked quietly. "For now, nothing," Daniel said. "Let me reach out to a contact who specializes in probate irregularities. If this was deliberate, we'll need more than suspicion. We'll need proof." That night, I couldn't bring myself to eat. The soup I'd made sat untouched on the counter. Instead, I went into Patrick's study again. I turned on the desk lamp and let its soft glow spill over his things. The tie clip still lay beside the folder, its surface gleaming faintly like a quiet witness. I opened the top drawer and began searching through the clutter. Old receipts, letters, half-used pens. At the very back, beneath a stack of yellowed envelopes, I found something I didn't remember seeing before. A small, leather-bound notebook. Patrick's handwriting covered the first page, dated 7 months before his death. Meeting with Rebecca tomorrow regarding trust language. She insists on updates. I'm not comfortable, but she says it's necessary for future oversight. We'll discuss with Eleanor later. My throat tightened. He had known something was wrong. He'd felt it. I flipped through the next few pages. Notes about treatments, doctor visits, and then more about the estate. She brought the documents again. Wants my signature while I'm lucid. Doesn't like when I ask questions. Says time is short. I stopped reading, my heart pounding. Time was short. That's what she had told him. I pressed my hand to the paper, as if I could reach through it. As if I could pull him back and tell him not to sign anything. I read on. Didn't tell Eleanor. Don't want her to worry. But something's off. Must speak with Daniel soon. He'd written that only 2 weeks before he was hospitalized for the final time. And after that, nothing. The entries stopped abruptly, just an empty page. I sat there for a long time, staring at that blank paper. It felt like standing at the edge of a sentence that had never been finished. Patrick had tried to protect me, even at the end, but in doing so, he had left me blind. When I finally closed the notebook, I realized my hands were trembling. Every line, every word was proof that Rebecca had known exactly what she was doing, and that Patrick had tried, in his own quiet way, to warn me. I placed the notebook beside the tie clip, side by side like two voices speaking the same truth in different tongues. And for the first time, I didn't feel powerless. The silence that had filled the house for months no longer felt like absence. It felt like a pause before something began. Rebecca thought she had buried every trace of what she'd done. But she had underestimated me. And she had underestimated Patrick. The truth was here, waiting to be unearthed, and I was ready to dig. The next morning, the world outside looked deceptively calm. Sunlight spilling through the curtains, birds hopping along the fence, the kind of morning that used to make Patrick hum under his breath while reading the paper. But inside, my mind was a storm. I couldn't stop thinking about that notebook, the words he'd written, the fear between the lines. Rebecca hadn't just crossed a moral boundary. She'd crossed a legal one. I called Daniel as soon as the clock struck 9. He picked up immediately, as though he had been waiting for me. I found something, I told him, my voice trembling. Patrick kept a notebook. He mentioned her, the will, the changes. He said she pushed him to sign when he wasn't ready. There was a pause on the line. You still have it? He asked, his tone suddenly sharper. Yes, it's all there. His handwriting, the dates, even his doubts. Good, Daniel said firmly. That could be crucial. Don't let it out of your sight. I'll come by later this afternoon, and I want to bring someone with me. Who? A colleague, he said, a probate specialist. Her name's Lydia Velasquez. If we're going to move forward, we'll need someone who knows how to navigate the kind of mess Rebecca has created. By the time they arrived, I'd made coffee, though I couldn't bring myself to drink any. Daniel came in first, followed by a woman in her mid-50s, sharp eyes, steady posture, and an air of quiet authority. She introduced herself simply, no pleasantries wasted. I've read Daniel's summary, Lydia said, taking a seat at the dining table. What you're describing sounds like a combination of undue influence and document tampering. But we'll need proof, concrete proof. I slid the notebook toward her. This is his, I said softly. Patrick's handwriting. He wrote about her bringing papers to the hospital, about feeling pressured. She opened it, flipping through each page carefully, her brow furrowing as she read. When she finished, She looked up. "This," she said, tapping the page with her pen, "isn't just sentiment. This is evidence of intent, his state of mind. If the revisions Rebecca filed were made after he expressed this kind of doubt, we can challenge the legitimacy of those documents." Her tone was firm, but beneath it I sensed a glimmer of compassion. The understanding of someone who'd seen too many families torn apart by greed. Daniel added, "We'll need to verify the timeline. If we can show that Rebecca was managing his affairs while he was mentally or physically unfit, it strengthens the case." I nodded, though a part of me recoiled at the thought. I didn't want to think of Patrick as unfit. He had fought so hard to keep his dignity intact. But then I remembered how frail he'd been in those last weeks. The tremor in his hands, the way his signature shook like a leaf in the wind. Lydia continued, "We'll start by requesting full access to the digital records from Rebecca's firm, every draft, email, and timestamp. If she or her team made changes without authorization, there'll be a trail." The words "Rebecca's firm" made my stomach twist. I could already imagine her reaction. The cool mask of professionalism, the clipped responses. She would pretend to be calm, but underneath, she'd be seething. "What if she finds out what we're doing?" I asked. Daniel gave me a small, reassuring smile. "Then she'll know you're not the kind of woman she can erase." After they left, the house felt different. Not lighter exactly, but awake. For months, I had been drowning in grief and confusion, but now there was purpose, a direction. I went into Patrick's study and sat at his desk. The afternoon sun stretched across the floor, lighting up the notebooks, the tie clip, and the scattered pages of his life. For the first time, I didn't feel like a widow sifting through memories. I felt like a witness standing at the beginning of a reckoning. I ran my hand over the notebook again, whispering to the empty room, "We're not done, Patrick. Not yet." Outside, the wind picked up, and the old wind chime by the porch began to ring. Soft, steady, almost like an answer. It was late afternoon when Lydia called. Her voice, usually steady and composed, carried an edge I hadn't heard before. "Eleanor," she said, "we have what we need to move forward. But before we take this to court, I think you deserve to hear from her directly." Her words lingered in the air long after the call ended. Hear from her directly. The thought of facing Rebecca again made my stomach twist, but there was a part of me, a quiet, burning part, that needed to see her reaction when she realized I knew. By the next morning, the decision had settled in me like a stone. I wasn't going to wait for lawyers and hearings to define what I already knew to be true. I needed to look her in the eye and hear whatever lies she thought she could still sell. The drive to her office felt longer this time. The city streets looked sharper, clearer, as though I were seeing them without the haze of grief for the first time. I parked in front of the building and sat there for a while, watching the steady rhythm of people moving in and out of the glass doors. Everyone looked purposeful, busy, confident. I used to be that way too. Before loss, before betrayal. When I finally went inside, the receptionist recognized me instantly. "Oh, Mrs. Harper," she said, her smile faltering. "I'll let Miss Collins know you're here." Rebecca appeared a few minutes later, every step measured, her expression perfectly neutral. "Eleanor," she said, her tone polite but distant. "I wasn't expecting you." I forced a smile. "I imagine you weren't." She gestured for me to follow her into her office. The space was immaculate, sleek lines, no clutter, a window overlooking the city. Everything about it screamed control. She sat behind her desk, crossing her legs neatly, and folded her hands in her lap. "What can I do for you?" For a moment, I said nothing. I just watched her. The calm mask, the carefully curated grief that had fooled everyone else. Then I reached into my bag and placed Patrick's notebook on her desk. Her eyes flickered. Just for a second. But I saw it. The slip. The hesitation. Then the mask returned. "What's this?" "You tell me," I said softly. "You were the one bringing him documents when he was too weak to hold a pen. You were the one who said he'd already decided. But here," I tapped the open page. "Here, he writes about not being ready, about how you insisted, about how it felt wrong." Rebecca didn't move. Her eyes lowered briefly, then lifted again, calm and cold. "Eleanor, grief makes people see things that aren't there. Patrick trusted me to help him organize his affairs. You know how meticulous he was. He didn't want to leave you overwhelmed." I leaned forward, my hands resting on the edge of her desk. "He didn't want to leave me erased?" Her jaw tightened. "No one erased you." I almost laughed, softly, bitterly. "You took our home, our trust. You had him sign papers he didn't understand, and you called it helping. You stole from him, Rebecca, and from me." She sat back, studying me the way one might study a difficult client. "If you have concerns," she said finally, "I suggest you speak to your attorney." "Oh, I have," I replied. "Two of them, actually. And one of them found something interesting. Witness signatures that don't exist. Documents with no legal trail. Would you like to explain that too?" For the first time, her composure cracked. Not much, just a faint twitch at the corner of her mouth. "You're making serious accusations." "No," I said quietly. "I'm uncovering serious truths." A long silence followed. Outside, I could hear the muffled hum of the city. Car horns, distant chatter. Inside, the room felt frozen. Rebecca looked down at the notebook again, then back at me. "Patrick was confused," she said at last, her voice softer now. "He didn't always know what he was signing. He asked me to help because he trusted me to do what was best." The words hung between us, heavier than anything she'd said before. She had admitted it, without realizing it. I saw it in her eyes, in the way she looked away the moment the sentence left her lips. I stood slowly. "You're right," I said. "He did trust you. That's what makes this unforgivable." As I walked out of her office, she didn't try to stop me. She didn't call after me or protest. She just sat there, staring at the open notebook as if it might speak back. When I stepped outside, the air felt cold and sharp against my skin. But I welcomed it. It woke me up. Rebecca could lie, manipulate, and pretend. But now the truth had a voice, and it was mine. That night, after my confrontation with Rebecca, the house felt different. Not quieter. No, the silence had always been there, but heavier. It pressed against the walls like the weight of something unspoken, something watching. I made myself tea and sat by the window, staring out at the faint shimmer of streetlights through the rain. My reflection stared back at me, older, yes, but harder too. I barely recognized the woman looking back. I had walked out of her office with my head held high, but the moment I closed the door behind me, the exhaustion hit. It wasn't just the physical kind. It was the weariness that seeps into the bones when you've spent too long being dismissed, ignored, and written out of your own story. Still, I couldn't stop replaying that moment, the flicker in Rebecca's eyes when I placed Patrick's notebook on her desk. She hadn't expected that. For the first time, I had seen her lose control, even if only for a heartbeat. That small crack in her composure gave me something I hadn't felt in months. Power. But power, I was learning, comes with loneliness. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the floorboards pulled me back to wakefulness. My mind wandered to Patrick's last weeks and all the small things I'd ignored. The way Rebecca had started speaking for him during doctor's visits, the forms she'd whisked away with a smile, the decisions made on his behalf. At the time, I'd told myself it was kindness. Now I knew better. She hadn't just stolen money or property. She'd stolen time, the precious final days when Patrick and I should have been together, uninterrupted. She'd turned those moments into transactions, signatures, legal filings. She'd buried him in bureaucracy long before the ground ever did. The thought made something inside me twist. Grief, yes, but beneath it, something sharper, something I hadn't let myself feel in months. Anger. I rose from the couch and went to his study. The air smelled faintly of him still, old books and aftershave, and that peculiar mix of ink and dust that always clung to his papers. The notebook, the tie clip, the letters, they were all there, spread out across his desk like fragments of a story I was piecing back together. For a long while, I just stood there, staring. Then I whispered into the stillness, "You tried to tell me, didn't you?" I imagined his voice answering, that soft chuckle of his. "I knew you'd find it, Ellie. You always do." I smiled faintly through the ache. "Well, I found it," I said aloud, "and I'm not letting her win." The next morning, Lydia called. "Eleanor," she said, "Daniel told me what happened with Rebecca." That was risky. "I know," I replied, but I needed to see her face, to hear her lie to me. There was a pause, then Lydia sighed softly. "You're stronger than you think, but from now on, no more direct contact. Let us handle it. We're filing the preliminary motion tomorrow." "What does that mean?" "It means we'll formally contest the will," she explained. "Once the motion is filed, Rebecca won't be able to move or liquidate assets without court oversight. It's the first step." The words washed over me, sharp and surreal. Contesting the will. I never imagined my life would come to this. Me, sitting alone in my kitchen, fighting a legal war against the woman who had once called me Mother Harper with polite affection. But grief has a way of reshaping everything you think you know. After we hung up, I walked to the garden. The air was cold and damp, but the roses Patrick planted were still clinging to life. Even this late in the season, their petals were faded, fragile, but they were still there, still standing. I touched one gently, tracing its edges. "You always said they'd bloom, no matter how harsh the winter," I whispered. "Maybe you were talking about me." That night, as I sat at his desk again, I felt the full weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't just about reclaiming money or property. It was about reclaiming him, reclaiming the truth. Rebecca had spent months crafting her version of events, rewriting our story to make herself the hero. But I wasn't going to let that stand. Patrick deserved better. I deserved better. I opened the notebook one last time and ran my fingers over his final entry, the one that ended mid-sentence, as if he had run out of strength before finishing the thought. For a moment, I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them away. "Don't worry," I said softly, closing the book. "I'll finish it for you." And as the wind brushed against the window panes, I felt it again, that quiet presence that had followed me since the will reading. The whisper of him, not gone, not yet. Patrick had trusted me to find the truth, even if it took everything I had left. And I would. No matter how many walls Rebecca built, no matter how carefully she hid behind her polished lies, I would tear them all down. The morning of the hearing notice arrived cold and brittle. A thin frost covered the garden, turning every rose stem into glass. I stood by the kitchen window, watching the sunlight catch on it, and thought how fragile everything looked, how easily beauty cracked under pressure. That was how I felt too. But under that brittleness, something had hardened inside me. Something resolute. Lydia called just after 9. "It's official," she said. "The court accepted the motion. Rebecca's been notified. The estate is frozen until further review." For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "So, she can't touch anything?" I asked finally. "Not without disclosure or permission," Lydia confirmed. "You've bought yourself time, Eleanor. Time to gather everything we need. Time." It was the one thing Rebecca had stolen most effectively, rushing through decisions, paperwork, funerals, grief. But now, time was mine again. After the call, I sat at Patrick's desk with my tea cooling beside me. I opened his notebook and reread the last entry, the unfinished one that ended mid-sentence. I traced my finger along the ink where his pen had stopped, the line that faded halfway through a word. I imagined his hand trembling, his breath shallow. Maybe he had meant to write my name next. Maybe he had meant to warn me of everything that was coming. I would never know. But now, at least, I was doing what he hadn't been able to, finishing what he started. Later that day, Daniel came by. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from too many years in courtrooms and too many stories like mine. He brought a folder thick with documents, and when he set it on the table, the sound of it felt heavier than anything I'd ever heard. "This," he said, "is what she didn't expect you to have." Inside were copies of bank transfers, emails, and correspondence between Rebecca and her firm. Lydia had managed to pull them through discovery orders before the freeze. There it was in black and white, Rebecca's name beside account movements and revisions, notes like streamline authorization, and signatures pending, expedite. I stared at the pages until they blurred. "She did all of this while he was dying," I whispered. Daniel's expression didn't change. "It happens more than you think," he said quietly. "People like Rebecca, they take advantage of chaos. They count on silence, on trust. They know the people they hurt won't have the strength to fight back." He closed the folder and looked at me. "But you did." Those words stayed with me long after he left. But you did. That night, I lit a fire for the first time in months. The house filled with the familiar crackle and warmth I had been avoiding since Patrick's death. I sat on the rug in front of it, the documents spread out beside me, and watched the flames dance. I thought about Rebecca, how she had always been so careful, so composed, so sure that her version of events was the only one that mattered. But now, her precision was her undoing. Every perfect detail she'd crafted left a trace, every lie an echo. I thought too about Patrick, not the man in those final frail days, but the one who had built this home with me, who had planted the roses and stayed up late fixing squeaky doors because he hated the sound of something unresolved. He had believed in fairness, in truth, and I realized that this fight wasn't just about what I had lost. It was about what he had stood for all his life. The anger that had once felt raw and consuming had changed now. It wasn't burning anymore. It was steady, like the slow, deliberate flame in the fireplace, strong enough to warm, sharp enough to destroy what needed to be burned away. I didn't know what the court would decide or how long this battle would stretch on, but I did know this. Rebecca had underestimated the one thing that had always defined me: persistence. As the fire settled into quiet embers, I whispered into the dim room, "We're going to win this, Patrick. Not for money, not for pride, for truth." And in the faint flicker of the flames, I almost imagined I saw him there beside me, smiling, quiet, proud. The following week moved like fog, slow, uncertain, but carrying the weight of something inevitable, Lydia had warned me that once the motion was approved, things might get interesting. I hadn't asked what she meant at the time, but now I understood. On Tuesday afternoon, I received a call from her office. "Eleanor," she said, her tone measured but purposeful. "Someone has agreed to come forward." A witness. The word hung in the air like a sudden gust. A witness? Who? One of Rebecca's assistants. "Her name is Ava Kendall," Lydia replied. "She was involved in the filing process and wants to speak privately before the deposition. She claims she saw something she couldn't explain." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. This was the crack we'd been waiting for. The kind of truth that didn't come from papers or signatures, but from someone who had been there, someone who had seen. We arranged to meet the next morning at Lydia's office. The air was sharp and cold when I arrived, the kind of cold that bites through your coat and settles into your bones. I was early, so I sat in the lobby, listening to the hum of the city outside the window. When the door opened and Ava walked in, I recognized the look on her face before she even spoke. I'd seen it before in my own mirror, the look of someone who'd carried a secret too long. She couldn't have been more than 35. Her hair was tied back, her hands clasped tightly together as if holding herself steady. Lydia ushered her into the small conference room, and Daniel joined us shortly after. I sat at the far end of the table, my hands folded in my lap. Ava spoke softly, but her words cut clean. "Mrs. Harper," she began, "I didn't know about everything Rebecca was doing. I just followed her instructions. But there was one evening, about 6 weeks before your husband passed." She paused, steadying her breath. "She asked me to witness his signature on a document. I thought it was routine. Only when I came into the office, Patrick wasn't there. I felt the blood drain from my face. He wasn't there?" She shook her head. "No. Rebecca said he'd stepped out, but that it was urgent, so she had already gotten his signature earlier. She told me to just sign as witness and backdate it." Daniel leaned forward. "And you did?" "Yes," she said, shame flickering across her eyes. "I didn't think much of it then. But when I saw the news about his death, and later how quickly everything was processed, it didn't sit right with me. I went back and checked the metadata on the file." Lydia's brow arched. "And? The signature date and the digital timestamp don't match. The document was modified 2 days after it was supposedly signed. On a Sunday night, a chill ran through me. I remembered that Sunday. Patrick had been at home, too weak to leave the bed. I had made soup, tried to get him to eat, but he'd barely touched it. Rebecca had visited that afternoon, bringing papers for review. I hadn't thought to ask what they were. Ava looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." I should have said something sooner, but Rebecca, she's powerful, and I needed the job. I wanted to be angry, but I couldn't. Instead, I felt something else, sadness perhaps, or gratitude that someone had finally chosen truth over silence. "You're saying she forged his signature," I said slowly. Ava nodded, or at least facilitated it after the fact. The version she filed wasn't the one he signed. Daniel exhaled deeply, the kind of sound that meant he'd been waiting to hear this. Lydia, ever composed, began jotting notes in her pad. "This changes everything," she murmured. "For me, it changed more than that. It wasn't just validation, it was vindication." After the meeting, I stood outside for a long while, watching the traffic move in slow motion down the street. People rushed past, unaware that a single truth had just turned my world upside down. I didn't feel victory, not yet, but I felt something stronger than fear. For months, Rebecca had believed she could hide behind polished signatures and legal jargon, but now her lies had a witness, and for the first time since Patrick's death, I could feel the scales beginning to shift. The day after Ava's confession, the air around me felt charged, like the calm that sits on the edge of a storm. For months, I had been stumbling through fog, searching for pieces of a truth I couldn't yet see. Now, the outlines were beginning to take shape. I finally knew what had been done, how Rebecca had done it, and who had helped her. And more importantly, I knew she couldn't hide anymore. Lydia called that morning to confirm that Ava had agreed to a formal deposition. "She's nervous," Lydia said, "but determined. We'll move forward carefully." Once her statement is signed, Rebecca's entire defense begins to unravel. The words made my chest tighten, not from fear, but from a cautious, trembling relief. For the first time, someone other than me was standing up to Rebecca's power. Someone had seen through her charm, her precision, her false grace. It wasn't just my voice echoing in the dark anymore. That afternoon, I decided to walk to the old park where Patrick and I used to spend quiet evenings. The air was crisp and the trees were bare, their branches clawing at the pale winter sky. The benches were mostly empty except for a few bundled-up figures and a man feeding pigeons. I sat on the same bench Patrick loved, the one near the fountain, and closed my eyes. For months, I had carried my grief like a locked box. But now, with every passing day, it felt like the lid was loosening. Beneath the pain, something new was growing. Resolve, maybe even peace. As I sat there, I thought about Rebecca. I imagined her sitting in that sleek office, her carefully curated calm beginning to crack as she learned what Ava had done. She would deny it, of course. She always did. She would blame stress, claim confusion, pretend the details were misunderstood. But the paper trail told another story. And now there was a voice to go with it. I could almost hear Patrick's laugh in my memory, soft, reassuring. "You always said the truth has patience, Ellie. It waits for its moment. Maybe this was that moment." When I returned home, Daniel was waiting in his car outside my gate. He rolled down the window and smiled wearily. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, though I could tell he'd come on purpose. "Lydia just sent me the deposition draft. Ava's account lines up perfectly with the metadata we pulled. It's solid." I exhaled. "So what happens now?" "Now," he said, "we prepare for confrontation. Rebecca will be notified of the deposition and given the chance to respond. Once she sees how much we know, she'll have two choices: settle quietly or fight publicly. My guess is she'll try the former. She has too much to lose." I nodded, but deep down, I knew Rebecca wouldn't give up easily. She wasn't the type to surrender, not when control was the one thing she valued most. Still, hearing Daniel speak so calmly about justice made something in me settle. For months, I had felt like I was standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. Now, for the first time, the ground beneath me felt solid. Before Daniel left, he handed me a folder. "Keep this safe," he said. "It's the official filing copy. You'll want it for your records." I held the folder against my chest after he drove off. It felt almost symbolic, like holding a fragment of my own story, written not in grief, but in proof. That night, the wind outside howled through the eaves, but I didn't close the window. I liked the sound of it, the untamed rush of air against the quiet of my home. I sat by Patrick's desk, the documents spread before me, and let the wind carry through the curtains like an echo of him. I imagined Rebecca sitting in her home, the email from Lydia's firm open on her screen. I imagined her reading Ava's statement, her breath catching when she realized what it meant. For months, she had orchestrated every detail, every decision. But the one thing she hadn't accounted for was conscience, the quiet courage of one woman who refused to keep pretending. For the first time in a long time, I felt something like peace. Not because the battle was over, but because I could see the path through it. I whispered into the empty room. "It's starting, Patrick." She's finally being seen for what she is. The house creaked softly in reply, like an old friend nodding in agreement. And that night, as I drifted into sleep, I felt no fear, just the quiet certainty that the tide was turning, and that this time it was turning in my favor. The storm that had been brewing for weeks finally broke, though not in thunder or lightning, but in the quiet rustle of paper against my doorstep. It was early morning when I found the envelope. Pale cream, thick paper, no return address. Only my name written across the front in that tight, precise script I knew too well. Rebecca Collins. For a long time, I didn't move. I stood there in my robe, the kettle whistling in the background, the world outside still half asleep. My heart thudded like it used to when Patrick would hand me one of his surprise letters, little notes he'd leave tucked inside recipe books or coat pockets. But this one carried no warmth. This one hummed with the chill of confrontation. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it while my tea grew cold. Finally, I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, perfectly centered, and signed in neat blue ink at the bottom. "Mrs. Harper, I've been informed of recent claims regarding my professional conduct and the handling of your late husband's estate. These accusations are deeply hurtful and unfounded. I can only assume they stem from grief and misunderstanding. I wish to remind you that spreading false allegations carries legal consequences. I have always acted within the bounds of law and in the best interest of Patrick's legacy. However, in the spirit of respect for your loss, I am willing to meet privately to discuss an amicable resolution, provided you withdraw the current inquiry. Sincerely, Rebecca Collins." No warmth, no apology, not even a hint of remorse. Just the cold polish of someone who had spent her life speaking through legal threats instead of empathy. I read it twice, then a third time, each word cutting deeper. Best interest of Patrick's legacy. The audacity of it. She had stolen that legacy, twisted it into something transactional. And now she wanted to meet as though we were equals negotiating peace. But what struck me most wasn't her arrogance. It was her fear disguised as composure. She was worried. I called Daniel first. He listened quietly as I read her letter aloud. When I finished, there was a long pause before he said, "That's a preemptive strike. She's trying to intimidate you before the deposition goes public." "So what do I do?" He hesitated. "You do nothing. Not yet. Let her squirm. The more she tries to reach out, the more we know she's losing control." But even as he said it, I could hear the tension in his voice, the knowledge that power like Rebecca's doesn't crumble easily. She'd spent years building walls of influence and reputation. It would take more than truth alone to bring those walls down. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the letter. The paper was smooth, heavy, expensive, the kind meant for people who believed they could buy authority. Patrick had used the same kind once, back when he ran the foundation, but his letters had always smelled faintly of ink and warmth. This one smelled of ink and fear. I folded it carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and tucked it inside the folder with the others. Patrick's drafts, Ava's statement, the old notebook, a growing archive of deceit, truth, and the space in between. That evening, Lydia called. Her voice carried the kind of quiet triumph I had come to trust. "We've submitted Ava's deposition," she said. "It's officially on record. Once the court reviews it, Rebecca's letter won't matter." I told her about the threat, about the way Rebecca had worded it so precisely, so measured. Lydia's reply was simple. "She's trying to frighten you, Eleanor." "Don't let her." "I'm not frightened," I said, though my voice trembled slightly. "Just angry. Angry that she still thinks she can control the story." Lydia paused before replying. "She can't anymore. Not with what we have now." After we hung up, I stood by the window, watching the last traces of daylight fade. The garden outside was quiet, blanketed in frost. I thought of Patrick's roses beneath the soil, still alive, still waiting for spring. Rebecca's letter sat locked away now, just another artifact of her desperation. Once, I might have crumbled under her threats, believing her power was too vast to challenge. But that time had passed. The truth no longer frightened me. It strengthened me. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I whispered softly to the empty house, "You tried to erase me, Rebecca. But I'm still here." And for the first time, I believed it completely. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and windless, the kind of stillness that made every sound echo. I woke before the alarm, long before dawn, and sat at the edge of my bed for a while, listening to the quiet hum of the radiator. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. Months of grief, searching, and disbelief had led to this, the day the truth would finally step into the light. I dressed carefully, the way Patrick would have wanted me to. A navy wool coat, polished shoes, and his old silver brooch pinned neatly to my lapel. I caught my reflection in the mirror. Older, yes, but sharper somehow. For the first time since his death, I didn't see a widow swallowed by loss. I saw a woman who had survived it. Outside, the cold air bit at my cheeks as I stepped into the waiting cab. The city was waking slowly, coffee shops flickering to life, streetlights fading against the pale morning sky. As we drove toward the courthouse, I thought of Patrick. I could almost hear him teasing me, saying, "You always hated mornings, Ellie. Trust you to take on a fight this early in the day." I smiled even as my chest tightened. Lydia and Daniel were waiting for me in the courthouse lobby. Lydia's expression was calm as always, though I noticed the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. "She's here," she said quietly. "Rebecca arrived about 15 minutes ago." I followed her gaze across the marble floor. There she was, perfectly put together, her hair pinned, her navy suit pressed without a wrinkle. She looked every bit the picture of control, though I caught the faint twitch in her hand as she adjusted her briefcase. Fear hides in the smallest movements. We didn't speak, not then, but when her eyes met mine, something passed between us. Something raw and silent. A recognition that this was no longer about money or property or signatures. It was about truth, about which of us would have the courage to stand in it. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, more intimate. There was no jury, no flashing lights or cameras, just a judge, a clerk, and a few quiet observers who had come for other cases. I sat at the table beside Lydia, my fingers folded in my lap. Across from us, Rebecca sat flanked by two lawyers, both younger than her, both too confident. The judge entered and the room rose. His voice, calm and measured, filled the space. "We're here to review the preliminary motion concerning the Harper estate and allegations of undue influence." It began with documents. Lydia laid them out like a map. Patrick's drafts, his notes, Ava's deposition. The judge read silently, occasionally adjusting his glasses. Rebecca's lawyers objected a few times, their voices crisp and practiced. But Lydia countered with the kind of quiet precision that only truth can carry. Then came the part I had both dreaded and longed for, the testimony. Ava was called first. She looked nervous. her hands clasped tightly around her statement. But when she began to speak, her voice was steady. She described the night Rebecca had asked her to witness a signature that wasn't Patrick's, how she'd felt uneasy, how the timestamps didn't match. Every word was clear, factual, undeniable. Rebecca didn't look at her. When Ava finished, Lydia stood. "Your Honor," she said, "we're not here to rewrite the past, only to protect the truth that was buried beneath it." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes moving from Lydia to Rebecca, then to me. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "is there anything you wish to add?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. But then I thought of Patrick's handwriting, that unfinished sentence, and the way he had trusted me, even in silence, to find my way back to the truth. "Yes," I said softly, standing. My husband was a good man. He trusted easily, too easily, and in his final months, that trust was used against him. I'm not here for vengeance. I'm here because he deserved better. Because we both did. My voice didn't shake. Rebecca's eyes flickered, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. Not furious, not indignant, just uncertain. The judge leaned back, thoughtful. "We'll review all submissions and issue a ruling in due time," he said, "but I commend the courage it takes to speak when others would stay silent." When it was over, I stepped outside into the cold afternoon air. The sky had cleared, a faint winter sun breaking through the clouds. Daniel touched my shoulder gently. "You did well," he said. "Whatever happens next, you've already changed the story." I nodded, my breath forming small clouds in the air. That's all I ever wanted. For months, Rebecca had written me out of Patrick's story. But that morning, in that courtroom, I had written myself back in, not as a victim, not as a widow, but as the keeper of truth. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of silence lift. The ruling came 2 weeks later, not with fanfare or flashing headlines, but with the simple ring of the doorbell on a cold Tuesday afternoon. When I opened the door, the courier handed me a thick envelope stamped with the county seal. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it. After everything, the sleepless nights, the grief, the endless documents and hearings, it all came down to this. A few sheets of paper folded neatly inside. I carried it to the kitchen table, the same table where I'd first read Rebecca's letter months ago. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. The words blurred for a moment before my eyes adjusted. After review of all testimony, documentation, and verified witness accounts, the court finds substantial evidence of undue influence and document alteration regarding the Harper estate. The original trust and will, as drafted prior to the contested revisions, shall be reinstated. All administrative privileges previously transferred to Ms. Rebecca Collins are hereby revoked. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. It was over. Rebecca had lost. The air around me felt different, thinner, lighter. For so long, I'd lived under the weight of what she'd done, the heaviness of betrayal pressing on every breath. Now, that weight lifted. But the strangest thing was, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't even feel vindicated. I just felt quiet, like the earth after a storm. Wreckage still visible, but the wind finally still. Daniel came by later that afternoon, holding a copy of the same letter. He didn't knock right away. He just stood on the porch for a moment, smiling in that quiet way of his. "You did it," he said as I opened the door. "We did it," I corrected him. Inside, we sat with tea as he explained the details. How Rebecca had been advised to step down from the foundation's board, how her firm had entered a formal review how the accounts had been restored. But I barely heard the logistics. All I could think about was Patrick. His voice, his laughter, the way he used to say, "Truth doesn't shout, Ellie. It waits until it can't be ignored." I imagined him sitting in his favorite chair across from me, smiling that patient smile of his. And for the first time since his death, I didn't feel the sharp sting of loss. I felt something gentler. Presence. When Daniel left, he pressed my hand. "This was never about revenge," he said quietly. "You gave Patrick his dignity back." His words followed me long after the door closed. That evening, I went to the garden. The frost had finally begun to lift, revealing the first shoots of green pushing through the soil. Patrick's roses, stubborn as ever, were finding their way back to life. I knelt beside them, brushing away the brittle leaves. The house behind me stood silent, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. Every wall, every creak, every echo. For months, I had feared it would become a monument to betrayal. Instead, it had become a sanctuary of truth. As I stood, I noticed the faint glow of the setting sun catching on the window, right where Patrick's study used to be. I could almost see him there, hunched over his desk, writing something in that slow, deliberate way he always did. Maybe a note, maybe a letter I'd never found. But somehow, I knew the message would have been simple. "You're home, Ellie. You made it." I went back inside and poured myself a small glass of wine, the kind Patrick used to save for occasions that mattered. I sat at the kitchen table, unfolded the ruling again, and read it one last time. Then I folded it neatly and placed it beside his tie clip. Not as evidence, not as proof, but as closure. The fire crackled softly in the next room, and I let the warmth settle around me. I thought of Rebecca, how she had tried to rewrite our story in her own image, and I realized something important. I didn't hate her anymore. She'd lost far more than property or control. She'd lost her reflection, the version of herself she wanted the world to believe in. As for me, I hadn't just won a case. I had reclaimed something greater. My voice, my place, and the truth of the life Patrick and I built together. When I finally turned out the lights and headed upstairs, I paused by the window one last time. The moonlight spilled across the garden, soft and silver. The roses would bloom soon. They always did. And this time, when they did, I'd be ready to see them.